Good afternoon and welcome to the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and the Economy's webinar, Breaking Down the 2021 Budget. I'm Lisa Sampson, Managing Principal of StrategyCorp's Ottawa office, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Today we will be exploring Budget 2021 in detail, what it said, how Canadians might react to it, and what it all means from a political perspective. We are excited to welcome our panel for this discussion, and in the interest of time, I will give a brief introduction for each panelist and then we'll get started. Kevin Page served as Canada's first parliamentary budget officer and is now President and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Nick Nanos is a leading corporate business strategist who serves as Chief Data Scientist and founder of one of Canada's most distinguished research companies, Nanos Research. And Nancy Hepner, who is a former cabinet minister and MLA in the Saskatchewan Legislative Assembly, and she also worked federally for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Currently, she is a senior advisor at StrategyCorp. Just a quick note on process. There will be time for an audience Q&A at the end of the session, so please submit your questions to our conversation using the Zoom webinar chat function. So let's get started. On Monday, Federal Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland tabled her first budget. It was a day of firsts. The first budget tabled by Canada's first female finance minister since the government was elected in 2019, and the first since the start of the global pandemic. We're going to start with Kevin. On the fiscal side, the budget announces $101.4 billion in new spending and reveals that the 2020-2021 deficit was $354.2 billion. And that's about $28 billion below forecast. The budget outlines a plan to gradually decrease that deficit heading into 25-26. Kevin, having worked in the Department of Finance and written multiple budgets yourself, can you put this spending and the spending trajectory into perspective?
Hi, Lisa. So, yeah, historic budget, as you alluded to, I think you could only understand the spending in the context of a global pandemic. So, those deficits and the trajectory of those deficits, for the most part, it reflects the spending line, as you've noted. Certainly in 2020-21, because of the deep recession, we shrank about 5.5%. We saw revenue shrink as well. But yeah, it was really the spending line that moves the numbers. It's the reason why we have a $350 billion deficit last year and why we're looking at a $150 billion deficit this year, trending down to $40 billion. So almost, if you look at just the spending line itself, it's gone from it probably increased a better part of $300 billion in 1 year. And again, we're like a $2.4 trillion economy. So it's like, there is no comparison in my lifetime. And, to be honest, I'm not even sure you could look at the wartime numbers and really find a direct comparison. So how do you get the deficit to decline to get back to something that looks like normal in the outer years? It's really unwinding those fiscal supports, which are still remain very strong. Even in the year 2021-22, we saw a number of extensions for some key programs with respect to wages, and rental subsidies, emergency business supports. So, yeah, I think it's, again, the budget, it's $100 billion worth of spending over the next 3 years. If you go over 5 years, it's $140 billion. If you add, we have 10 priorities. If you go through all the priorities, there's more than 250, different lines of spending. There's a little bit on the tax side, but not much. $140 billion with the spending over 6 years, maybe $10 billion with the revenue. So if you're just looking at it numbers, those are some of the high points.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Nick, how do you think Canadians are going to react to this budget?
Uncertainty in terms of the economy, uncertainty in terms of people's health, and voters are like everyone else. They don't like uncertainty. They like to know that they can send their kids to school safely, that their parents are safe and stuff like that. I think among the key takeaways was that the Liberals have clearly communicated that the current stimulus and support for individual Canadians and Canadian enterprises will continue. So they basically provided certainty, at least until September. The other thing is that they've telegraphed that there are certain types of Canadians, pockets of voters, so to speak, that are important that they want to help. And at the top of the list, I would put seniors and women, individuals, households with families with this childcare benefit, and also the seniors help. But I think the interesting twist in this, and Kevin talked about the deficit numbers and basically the big spending is, the polling that we've done suggests that Canadians on the deficit at least are cross-pressured. On the one hand, a pretty strong majority of Canadians are concerned about the size of the deficit, and then at the same time they're cross-pressured because they know that that deficit actually is basically a direct transfer to many Canadians, at least a significant part of that. And so I think for the Liberals, they have to be careful that they're not too enthusiastic about these big deficits, because I think Canadians see it as something necessary in order to get through the pandemic.
And Nancy, as we do the tour of the table here, you're the political practitioner in the mix. From your perspective, what stands out in terms of the content of the budget and how it was presented to Canadians?
To echo what Nick said, I think it actually reflects where Canadians are. I think there's two things on Canadians' minds. One is, how do we get through COVID in the immediate short term? Because we're hoping it's going to be more short term than long term. And then what comes next? There's a lot of people that we have found have a very tenuous attachment to the workforce. That's been highlighted through this pandemic. Whether it's youth or women in the workplace, their attachment has been tenuous throughout this. So I think the budget addresses some of those things that you can argue whether the government is choosing the right way to address those. But I think it offers a bit of peace of mind to those groups of people who are looking for some additional help. And I think too, people are willing to have the government run up the numbers a little bit more than they probably would in normal times, because these are not normal times. As a fiscal conservative myself, my concern is how do we get out of this, because somebody has to pay for this. It's not free money. And so in the long term, I think there's probably going to be some concerns. In the short term, I think people are willing to see government spend.
So you've all mentioned the COVID supports and COVID relief that's in this budget, and COVID-19 certainly seems to be top of mind for everyone in Canada, especially as we battle the third wave of the pandemic. Throughout the pandemic response, the federal government has not been afraid to leverage its fiscal firepower and move into areas that some may have considered traditionally provincial and jurisdiction. This would include the cross-country vaccination rollout, setting standards for long-term care, and the new proposal on child care. We seem to be seeing some shifts in how the FPT relationship functions that could have potential long-term ramifications. And there's also not always alignment in terms of what the federal government is doing and what provincial governments are asking for. Kevin, I'm just wondering if you can walk us through some of that dynamic and how it works, especially the $30 billion in spending on childcare and the government's recent announcement yesterday after the budget that they were going to also honor or partially honor the provinces and territories' wishes on increasing the Canada Health Transfer.
It's a great question, Lisa. This budget will put a lot of pressure on relationships between different levels of government and First Nations people. It's, again, a big spending budget, but I think if there are high stakes around it, it's really on the implementation side. So in the case of childcare, I think the federal government said we have money to spend, and we want a national program, and they set aside $30 billion over 5 years, and with the expectation that it will continue on. But we need to negotiate. It needs to be negotiated. So I think that's one kind of critical area. Like the provinces, definitely their purse strings are tight. And so it's again, the government's going to have to be, careful. Like, is there real ability to match some of this money? And, I actually don't think there's a lot of ability on the provincial side. I think the provinces welcome the federal government taking the lead on the pandemic supports, but as we go forward, because of their high debt loads and because they're not fiscally sustainable for the most part, they're going to be quite concerned how they negotiate. But I think, again, as you unpack other elements of the budget, whether it's infrastructure or on First Nations, that there's going to need to be a lot of negotiations, collaboration, and coordination with the provinces. So, people looking for these budget implementation bills over the next number of weeks, they're going to have to wait. I suspect there'll be multiple budget implementation bills because it's going to take time to negotiate, those arrangements with provinces and municipalities and First Nations groups.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, as somebody who's worked in politics and had to make some of these decisions, what do you think factored into the Liberal decision to promote childcare and a $30 billion program? And what are some of the things that are considered when you're creating a budget and making some of these choices, especially given the Fed-Prov tensions on healthcare spending?
Putting budgets together is not an easy thing. I was in cabinet, I was also on Treasury Board for 10 years, so there's a lot of budgets that I've been involved in. There's a lot of considerations when you look at what your priorities are for either your province or for the country. And I think one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, one, can we afford to do this? But on the flip side of that is, can we afford not to do this? And I think that's those questions were probably asked putting together this federal budget on the side of, can we afford not to do some of these things? And we've seen the supports, particularly COVID related, that are in this budget. And I think those things are important to get us through this. On the federal provincial side, on something like childcare, we know the Liberals have been trying to get this across the finish line for decades, I would say. It'll be interesting to see how the negotiations go with the provinces, because this is not 100% federal money. This is a 50-50 cost share with no previous discussions with the provinces. My understanding is there had not been those discussions leading up to this budget to let the provinces know this was going to be kind of their top issue coming down. So the discussions with the provinces are going to be interesting. We've seen this before in Canada. Every province knows what their own people need. They have their own set of priorities. They also have their own sets of fiscal capacity. So when you're looking at $50 with the provinces, can the provinces even afford to, sign on to a deal like that? This is a big ticket item. I know in Saskatchewan, there was an eye to be balanced within a few years. That's kind of out the window right now because of COVID and the pandemic and the economic ramifications coming from that. So I'm not quite sure how the federal government's going to navigate this when provinces are strapped right now to implement such a big ticket item.
Mm-hmm. Over to you, Nick, just on the Fed-Prov relationship and how that influences dynamics in your line of work, and also perhaps maybe a little bit on just how childcare might play out.
Sure. And no, did we hear like last year, like the age of Aquarius playing when Justin Trudeau and the premiers were all getting along, right? Was it the dawning of a new age? I think not. That is absolutely over, as now it's becoming a little more of a Hunger Games as provinces struggle to vaccinate Canadians and that they try to deal with the pandemic. But on the childcare front, the fact of the matter is that the Liberals, even though this is something that they've been focused on for quite a while, they've put in the window an eye-popping number that catches people's attention, and it demonstrates a particular commitment. The other thing that's very clear is that Minister Freeland is clearly behind this. It's very important to her personally, politically. She wants to see this happen as one of her potential legacies. But I have two predictions on the childcare front. And Lisa, maybe next budget when I'm invited back, if I'm invited back for the strategy
Absolutely.
budget debrief, you'll be able to play these clips back so that you can embarrass me. But I have two predictions. First of all, the Liberals know that the fact that there are a lot of moving parts on making this national childcare vision happen, that they will be able to politically use this to fearmonger in the next election, because what they're going to say is, if you vote for the Conservatives and the Conservatives will come in power, they might not be as committed to the national child care program that we promised you, and we still need to keep our negotiations. They'll talk about who's on board and who's not on board. So they'll be able to use that from a political perspective. The other prediction that I have is, you know what, our premiers are smart. Justin Trudeau and Freeland are showing up to the door with cash on something that the premiers know that they want to deliver on. So what type of negotiating leverage does the federal government have when they played out their cards and said that they want to have a program? So I would expect the smarter premiers actually to take advantage of the negotiations to get stuff like the healthcare transfer, because they know that the Liberals will want to deliver on this, not because it's just good politics, but because they truly want to deliver on this. So these negotiations, I think, are going to be much more stressful for the federal government, and provinces, I think, tactically are going to try to squeeze them in the negotiations.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to a question of elections and election timing, and what we all think. And I'd like to just do a bit of a tour of the table on that. Can we expect an election within the next month or two, or is the third wave too much and we're going to have to wait until the fall, until we've all been vaccinated? Nancy, I'm going to start with you on that question.
I think the Liberals would love to go to an election on this budget. I think they're going to have a hard time convincing Canadians that now is the time, considering the state of the country and the pandemic right now. I know the provincial governments or provinces have had pandemic elections, but the situation, I think, right now is pretty dire. I think, like I said, I think they really would love to run on this budget. This is an election budget. Let's not fool ourselves. That being said, they would have to do something to orchestrate a non-confidence vote in order for that to happen. I was kind of expecting a poison pill somewhere hidden in this budget. It might still be there in those 700 and some pages. I haven't found it yet. I don't think it's there. So something is going to have to happen in the next month or two if the Liberals really want to go to orchestrate that. I'm not sure how they would do that. And I don't think that people are really receptive for an election right now.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, it's been mentioned that that there's a bit of pressure, Nick mentioned a bit of pressure amongst voters on how high the deficit can go, because they know that the deficit and debt have to be paid for eventually. What's your take? I heard you say on Monday in response to questions from journalists that there might be a revenue side problem here. You've referred to it as a big spending budget, but how do you think Canadians are going to react, and what are some of the solutions that they could put in place to make this more palatable? And then Nick, I'm coming to you for the numbers on where things stand for the horse race. So Kevin, over to you first.
Yeah, so I agree with Nancy. I don't see how the government could orchestrate in the short term an election, though I think if the government's looking at the numbers, in the fall with, these projections of a strong growth coming in the fall with pent up demand and some higher disposable incomes and all that stimulus going on, which is really quite substantial this year. They front end loaded the stimulus that would be kind of perfect timing. And again, assuming that we can get a good vaccination process. In terms of promises, if we were to find ourselves in an election and people are saying, well, in addition to childcare, we're going to do other things. We want to make sure that the premiers get, the roughly $30 billion a year that they want, which would take us about the federal share up to about 35% of total healthcare spending. We're prepared to reform the social safety net. We want to start discussions around a basic income program. We realize that more money needs to be spent on climate change. Like if we start making those sort of big commitments, then you have to do something on the revenue side. And again, we've seen in Europe, we've seen in the United States that they're willing to talk about raising corporate income taxes. Even President Biden's willing to talk about raising corporate income taxes, but in addition, making their personal income tax system more progressive, particularly at the higher end, increasing marginal tax rates. So Like, I think that's a complicated conversation. I agree with Nancy. Like, government really didn't want to talk about that in this budget. So this budget really has that election feel to it. But yeah, if we want to do those, or I could have mentioned the Farmer Care program as well. All those things are multi-billion-dollar, actually, yeah, multi-billion-dollar ticket items. So we would need much higher revenues. You can't do it on the spending side with spending review. And there's still a lot of fragility in the economy, like over the short term. We're assuming this big rebound. We're still trying to climb out of the hole that we dug effectively last year. So we need more revenues if you want big ticket items, more big ticket items.
And just on the point of the infrastructure spending that's happening south of the border, the polling demonstrated that it actually was more palatable to Americans if there was a tax increase to pay for it, which is an interesting phenomenon. Nick, just give us a tour of the current party standings right now, and who has room to grow. I noted that we don't often talk about the NDP, but they're sitting at 19%. So who has room to grow, and has this budget boxed anybody in?
I don't think it's boxed anyone in. You know, the latest Nanos tracking numbers that we just released this week has the Liberals at 36, Conservatives at 29, NDP 19, and the Green Party at around 7%. And you know, one of the key takeaways from the polling numbers is not the top number, but the structure and distribution of support. And the structure and distribution of support for the Liberals is much more efficient at converting into seats. You know, the fact of the matter is when we look at the last federal election, you know, the Liberals, if they had swung about 20,000 votes and 14 seats, would have lost the popular vote and won a majority in the House of Commons. So, you know, at 36, the Liberals can convert that likely into a majority. But, you know, for the Conservatives, they're still within striking distance. And the big question mark for the Conservatives is Aaron O'Toole and his brand. 1 out of every 4 Canadians still don't have a formed opinion of him. And one of the battles for the Conservatives and the Liberals will be to define Aaron O'Toole. And, you know, to put this into context, when there's only a 7-point spread between the Liberals and the Conservatives, if the blue Liberals, wherever they may be, if they swing from, you know, Justin Trudeau over to Aaron O'Toole for whatever reason, you basically have a horse race. But on the upside, the 2 parties to actually watch, I believe, are the Greens and the New Democrats together. And, you know, the Liberal fortunes have been intertwined with the New Democrats, and the New Democrats basically on a number of occasions have been the parking spot for disaffected Liberals, where people are disappointed with either the Prime Minister or the Liberal Party or the government of the day. And they're like, I think I like the New Democrats. And then when you get on election day, they're like, well, we can't have the Conservatives win, and those progressive voters strategically hold their nose and vote Liberal. I think one of the more intriguing parties to watch will be the Green Party. And I say this because there's a broader international Green narrative. We may see a Green chancellor in Germany. The Green Party in Germany is in 2nd place. And, you know, where the Greens are successful, it's not when they're completely dogmatic, it's when they're pragmatic and that they basically have an environmental lens. You know, you talked about President Biden, you know, his directive to put all the decisions in the administration through an environmental lens. Do you know what? That's what Green parties do in other countries. Everything has that environmental lens. And I think Annamie Paul will be an intriguing alternative for people that might not be happy with the New Democrats and might not be happy with the Liberals. So I think the Greens are going to be one to watch. And so, you know, and the other thing is even though the Liberals have the advantage today, it doesn't mean that they'll have the advantage in the future, because what we've learned from the pandemic is that it is in effect a torture chamber in a horror movie. We think the monster is dead and it comes back to life. And that's probably going to be the hallmark of the election that will take place within the next year, that we might think that we have herd immunity, and then we'll find out that something happens, whether it's inability to get vaccines or a new strain where, you know, basically everything's kind of thrown up in the air. So yeah, I think even though the Liberals have an advantage, I don't think they should be comfortable, because there's not a lot of enthusiasm there right now.
Well, that's certainly very cheery, Nick. Nancy, what's your take just in terms of opposition parties and especially Aaron O'Toole? He announced the party's environmental plan last week. The Liberals have referred to it. Jonathan Wilkinson referred to it as a pamphlet. Do you think that he did enough, and do you think he's got enough to hold the party together?
I'm not sure. It's he seems to be having a hard time breaking through, and you know, to the point made previously about defining Aaron O'Toole, we've seen in the past Conservatives have defined new Liberal leaders, done it very effectively, and I think that you know, the Liberals need to do that a bit on the Conservative side. There's not much of a wow factor there. I don't know if he's really grabbing the attention of the electorate at the moment. And to Nick's point, there's a lot of people who just have no opinion of him, which is kind of the worst thing for a political leader, that he's kind of unknown. His environmental policies, you know, it's interesting. They came out with one finally, because that's been asked for quite some time. And a week later, the Prime Minister comes out with new targets yet again, and so it's going to be a tough thing for him to make a name on that front. I don't know that Conservatives have been historically known for being, you know, the cheerleaders on that file. So we'll see. As far as the other political leaders, I think for all of them, this is a tough week for them. We were chatting a bit before we went to air on this. I don't know that I would want to be any of them. The Liberals have done a pretty good job in this budget of picking bits and pieces from the other parties', either platforms or ideas or things that they brought to the House of Commons lately, whether they're big or small things. The Conservatives had proposed a 3-digit mental health crisis line. It's in the Liberal budget. Money to farmers to help them pay the costs of extraordinarily high carbon taxes on agricultural production in the prairies, which has been a big thing. The Conservatives have been calling for that. The Liberals adopted it. Childcare has been an NDP policy for a really long time, and now the Liberals have taken that. And then on budget day, both the Bloc and Aaron O'Toole came out and said, yes, but what about health transfers to the provinces? You completely ignored that. And then the next day, the Prime Minister came out and said, well, we're going to look at that too. So he's taking a lot of the ideas away from the other parties. There used to be a very stark contrast between parties. You knew exactly what the NDP stood for, exactly what the Conservatives stood for, and exactly what the Liberals stood for. And now those policies are it's that mushy middle. And I think it's going to be harder for the opposition parties to define themselves going into whenever this next election is, to define themselves, because the question is going to be, if not this budget and what the Liberals have proposed, which is a lot of money to a lot of people, what wouldn't you do? What would you take out of this budget? And that's not a question that any opposition party really wants to answer, because then you're taking money out of people's hands, and that's not going to leave a very favorable taste in people's mouths.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, any feedback on that? And I just wanted to remind people before I go to Kevin that we do have the Q&A function. If you go to the bottom of your screen, I know there's a couple of questions there right now. We will be going to questions in a few minutes. So if you have questions, please ask via the Q&A function. Kevin, over to you.
Yeah, in terms of party fortunes, I think there are opportunities for the opposition parties in this environment. I think it was a big move by leader of the official opposition, Mr. O'Toole, just to kind of try to make some headway on the environment, because he knows he's very sensitive there. So yeah, I think those are small steps, and I agree with Nancy that the gap's getting wider now. Yeah, I thought Nick's point that there's certainly with the Greens, like just an enormous opportunity globally now. Yeah, I think I heard that a French prime minister once said that governing is really about making choices, and the government, if I can take a word out of Nancy's book, is that the government's basically saying we can do everything and we don't really have to raise taxes. And I think that creates an opportunity as well. I think back to the Conservatives, that if they can come up with a stronger climate change plan and they could build a sense of fiscal responsibility and be a bit practical, that, you know, they can make some inroads as well there too. But I like a horse race. I think it's good. I think it's, you know, the next election could be quite powerful, and some of those big priorities of the future, whether it's climate change or income disparity, or, you know, more resilient economy, getting ready to deal with the next pandemic or the next shock. I think those are really interesting issues that to have, you know, 4 parties that are really have come good ideas. I'm looking forward to that debate.
Nick, over to you on O'Toole.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things. I don't know if I can dust off the Nanos polling time machine. Let's go back to Stephen Harper. I'll call it the, at one time, unhuggable policy wonk that people didn't think would ever be prime minister, right? Well, go figure. He beat the naysayers and the odds and was prime minister for quite a long period of time. It's not surprising for any party to rumble and grumble about their party leader. The difference here is that, you know, if you look at the continuum, why don't we say the ideological continuum, the parliamentary party and the rank and file party are not the same people that are average conservative voters who are a little more center right, and they're just more pragmatic and not as ideological. So he's basically got an internal party management problem, and I think, you know, his move on the environmental front is a good strategic move. And, you know, we talked about how inefficient the distribution of support was for the Conservatives. Well, you know what? Erin O'Toole can burn 10% of his support in the prairies, and if that yields 10% of support in Ontario, whammo, he could be the Prime Minister of Canada. So I think he understands that calculus, but, you know, the problem is, and this is my last point, is that if the Conservatives look divided, they're not going to win the election, because average Canadians will look at them and go, they can't even get their own act together, like they're not even behind their leader, and they're sniping and knifing their own leader. And so, you know, the Conservatives have to decide, what do they want? Would they prefer to have a conservative government that, you know, might be imperfect, but from their perspective, ideologically is better than having a liberal government? I think that's the decision that has to be made.
Yeah, there's a lot of fodder in that, especially as you look in Western provinces, in Saskatchewan and also in Alberta. Headlines today about Jason Kenney facing a revolt from UCP members. So it'll be interesting to see the time machine. We may take you up on that offer and go back in the time machine. Just in terms of questions, we did have one question that came in from somebody saying, we're hearing from Nick about the virus never being gone and over, and does that mean that the third wave becomes a fourth wave? And then we're hearing from Kevin about the government using its fiscal firepower in the form of the wage subsidy and business subsidies. How much longer, Kevin, can the government continue to do this? If we're still in the same situation in the fall, are we going past 1.5 trillion here?
I think there's an enormous amount of fiscal support and stimulus in the budget. And I think just to put it in context, so that, you know, we're talking about $150 billion deficit. That includes about $50 billion of you know, new spending, which is part support, part recovery related. In the December fall economic statement, there was another $20 billion of money going into 2021-22. I guess $75 billion stimulus package. That is enormous for an economy where people think it could grow in the 5.5% range, and the governor of the Bank of Canada thinks it can grow much higher than that. So, like, right now, as long as we can roll out, you know, the vaccination process, and you've seen some progress in recent weeks. If you look at the progress that we've seen in the United States and the UK and some other countries like Israel, like, you could see once the vaccination hits, like, you see that, you know, the number of people going to hospitals really fall off completely. So I think that there's prospects for a pretty strong recovery, again, that hinges on vaccination. And I think, again, the global markets, like, more and more when you look at them, they are becoming more and more optimistic about the future. So yes, we could see, we're going to struggle over the next few years, particularly with other parts of the world getting them vaccinated. That's going to be a big part of it. This stuff could cycle back. The virus can, with variants. And, we'll be getting vaccinated again next year. But I think there's more optimism than pessimism about 2021 right now in most people's minds.
We got a question on childcare and the 50-50 split. Nancy, just your thoughts on whether or not it is a 50-50 split with the provinces and how that actually bears itself out in reality, considering that the Canada Health Transfer started off a lot higher, and the ask of the premiers right now is to get it up to 35%, which is more back at 1970s percentages than anything we've seen currently. So how does childcare, my question for you is, how does this childcare promise kind of play itself out in discussions with the provinces and territories in light of the reality on the ground of the Canada Health Transfer and the feds bearing their share of the load?
Yeah, as it stands now, we've seen over the last few years the percentage of federal funding for the health transfer to the provinces, their percentage overall has been decreasing, which is why the provinces are asking for that $28 billion bump up. It's to get it back towards historical levels. So at the same time that the provinces are realizing less money from the federal government, as of this week, is asking the provinces to do more. And this goes back to having some very interesting discussions with the federal government. I don't know how they expect the provinces to do more when they literally are giving them less. So I don't think that they can have a childcare discussion without the health and transfer discussion. Not even just because we're in the middle of a pandemic and provinces are hurting. In normal times, that health transfer has been decreasing, and the costs to the provinces have been going up. We've seen a huge hit in healthcare costs across the country for provinces. So asking them to do a 50-50 on this childcare, and then, what are the details? It's nice to have a soundbite to say it's a $10 a day childcare. That's great, but is it going to be income tested? If you're a two-income family making $250,000 a year, do you need $10 a day childcare? Or is that money better spent targeting single working mothers who can't really afford? It's cheaper for them to stay home, and that's not what we want. We want women involved in the workplace. So I think that's what I'm going to be looking forward to in these discussions, is what exactly are the details behind this childcare plan? And how much is the provincial government expected to cover? So I think the health transfer, like I said, the health transfer pay discussion has to go hand in hand. The provinces are strapped. And like I said in my previous, when we were talking about this before, they announced it from my understanding, without having any discussions with the provinces to tell them that it's coming. Provinces have been putting their budgets into place based on their own priorities, and then the federal government throws this at them. So I'd love to be a fly on the wall during those discussions.
Kevin?
Yeah, I actually don't think we're going to get cost sharing on. I think the feds are going to have to just put the money in. We saw in 2020 that the feds carry on every dollar about 80 cents of the fiscal supports was really federal related. I think through the recovery, I think, again, even looking at some of the budgets that Nancy alluded to over the recent weeks, months, that the provinces are going to continue to look to the federal government to provide that sort of stimulus to get us, that kickstart to the economy after the virus. I would not be surprised on some of the on childcare and some of the additional infrastructure monies if there's really no cost sharing, that the feds just sort of drop that commitment and they provide the money and they have the fiscal room. When you look at these long-term fiscal sustainability studies, and with very few exceptions, the provinces don't have that room.
I got a specific question for Nick. So Nick, I'm going to ask you this question. What are your thoughts on consumer confidence as it relates to the travel industry? A sector that's been devastated and needs to rebuild. Governments have spent months telling people that travel is unsafe. What are your thoughts just on the travel industry and what has been provided in this budget, and what do Canadians feel safe to travel?
So, it's interesting. So we track consumer confidence writ large for Bloomberg every week. And, the key outlier here is that we are very exuberant, but it's basically because of real estate. The positive attitude towards the value of real estate increasing in people's neighborhoods, we've been tracking since 2008. It's basically breaking records every week. And we also know from our research is that for most Canadians, their house is their single largest investment. So even if they're not hot in the market, when they see prices going up, they feel good. It's not helpful for people that are not in the market. But the key thing for the travel industry, I would say, is that the government has dropped the ball in one area where realistically we are at war with the pandemic. And maybe we should be pulling we have to think of not just winning this war, but winning the future wars. There hasn't been a discussion on how the Canadian healthcare system, how the Canadian economy will be resilient for future pandemics. And this could be a critical advantage. And this is why, maybe we want to pull a page out of the book from the World War II, Keep Calm and Carry On. We should be thinking of how we build a resilient economy. And travel is a good example where it is, where the industry and the government demonstrate that it is safe, that it is controlled, that there are certain conditions so that people know will be respected by everyone and that it will be enforced, so that we can keep calm and carry on in terms of a lot of those other activities. And I worry about politicians prematurely declaring victory and thinking, okay, we can loosen things up, when realistically the strategy should be, how do we create an economic context that keeps our economy open, period, but keeps people safe at the same time, where we're not changing the rules, day to day and week to week because of pressure that one government might feel. And anybody that's talked to anyone worth their salt in the public health space, no one in the public health sector believed that there was going to be a quick victory over this. Everyone knows that it's a long haul. And our public health experts and our healthcare system is firefighting today. But I'm sure what they want to do is to start a conversation about how are we resilient in the future, so that businesses are open, so that people can safely travel, and they want to have that discussion just as much as everyone else. But I don't think it's happening anywhere. At least we're not hearing very much about it, and we didn't see anything in the budget about how our future economy will be resilient and how that could be a competitive advantage.
Thanks, Nick. We have another question about the revised targets, the climate targets that the government announced yesterday. Do we think, and I'll do a tour of the table starting with Nancy, do we think that the Conservatives and others are going to meet those targets, the revised targets, or do you think that it's a strategy on behalf of the Liberals to box in the Conservatives? I think it would just be a Conservative thing, or do you think the Greens or the NDP are going to go even further?
I was reading through some of the articles this morning, and I think the Green Party for sure had higher targets than what the Liberals had announced this week. I think it does box the Conservatives in. The comment that I found interesting was that the federal government said that they could reach the new targets with existing programs, which leads me to ask, if that was possible, then why were these not the targets to begin with? So I'm not sure how we increase the target but don't change the Liberal program. So that'd be a question that I would have. I think there might be pressure for the Conservatives to follow suit, but I do think if they articulate their program effectively and show that it does make a difference with the targets that they've adopted, I think people will be willing to listen to that discussion. I think when you start talking about 36% or 40% over 2005 and get kind of lost in those details, I think you lose the electorate as well, because it's hard to explain what that actually means. I think if the Conservatives make a concerted effort to stick to the targets that they have with a very clearly articulated plan that people understand, I think they'll be okay on that front. I don't know that they have to change to meet the Liberal targets. I just think that they need to have a really good plan that Canadians will understand. The trouble with the entire climate change portfolio is it's usually a very long answer to a short question. So it has to be easy to understand.
Kevin, if you were giving advice to the government on how to reach the targets, either the old targets or the new targets, what would you advise them? Is there enough fiscal capacity in there to reach some of those targets? I'm thinking of land conservation in particular, and other things. I mean, these are costly line items that actually need to be funded by governments, at least in partnership with others. So what would your advice be to this government? Do they have enough there?
Yeah, so like I think it's we want our political leaders to set targets. I think today's a great day to have an international conference, and just to see countries coming to the table that you couldn't have seen maybe a year ago with a different president of the United States. So I'm okay with the setting of targets. What I think we're really missing, and I think really undermines confidence, is I think it's Nancy's point. We don't see the plan. Like I think Canadians, again, if they're sitting around their tables, they want to know, like, what does it really take to get to net zero? What kind of, how do we have to move the numbers over the next 10 years to really feel comfortable we can get there? Are we doing our part? They want to see like a carbon budget, in the same ways that they all have a budget for their family. Like, what is emitting carbon, or what is coming from our building industries, the cement and steel? What is coming from our generation of electricity? What is coming through transport or agriculture? And what's the plan sector by sector to get down to net zero, or get to those 2030 targets? We don't see that. And I think we had some down payments in the budget and across a wide array of spending that could really help us get there, on clean technologies or on electrification of our transportation system. But I think most of us have a sense that it's just these are just small down payments. Like, we have 10 priorities in this budget. If we had a different government, didn't find ourselves in election mode, we could have really made climate change as a central feature of the recovery package of the post-COVID economy. I just don't think we're comfortable that we can see the plan that Nancy articulated. It's not articulated.
Nick?
The thing is for any country to meet its objectives, people have to be empowered in order to do that, and they have to feel that they're part of the solution. It's interesting. I remember looking at some data from the International Energy Association, and it showed a drop in the United States of carbon consumption. And I remember asking the economist at the time, what happened that year? And they said, well, that's when we started making more fuel efficient cars. People were consuming less. And the thing is there's all of the parties right now are fixated on incentives, taxing one way or another carbon, but there hasn't been a discussion, and this surprises me for the Conservatives at least. There hasn't been a discussion on how do we reduce consumption, right? Let's maybe not just talk about punishing people who want to use carbon fuel. Let's talk about how Canadians can consume less. Let's talk about how companies can consume less carbon and less energy and make themselves more profitable. How can we talk to homeowners and say, you know what, if you consume less electricity, that's more money in your pocket to pay for your kids to go to university, or to do something else. And we've been focusing a lot on the tax side, and I think governments like to do that. But I think we need the parties to creatively think about ways where actually Canadians benefit from consuming less, and that includes less packaging. I think that includes less electricity, all that stuff. And if we can think of strategies to get Canadians to consume less, they're going to realize that it's kind of like Kevin and Nancy will remember this and Lisa, you'll remember this in the 1970s, where we had an Ontario government talk about conserving energy, right? Turn off the lights, right? Conserve energy, you save money. Those are the things that we need to talk about, because right now, whenever we do polling on these targets, it's like people's eyes glaze over. It's like, I've heard this before, but it seems that's all we find out is that we never make our targets. So why would this particular promise be any different from anything else when we're doing basically the same things, or many of the same things we've been doing in the past?
So we have one more question that came in, and Kevin, this is for you. A lot of the excess pandemic spending globally is premised on a large appetite for purchases of government debt. The government's own central banks have been massive purchasers of securities, and what happens if the flow of funds becomes constrained, or will it become constrained? could it?
Yeah, so there's, I think we've, over the past 10 years, we've taken quantitative easing to a whole new level. I think central banks have often taken government debt and put it on its balance sheets. That's not a new thing, but I think it's become, we certainly increased the use of that tool, that instrument, after the through the 2009-10 global financial crisis. And now, it's almost like central banks around the world their balance sheets have exploded by just taking on government debt, and we've seen expansions of that beyond just the federal debt in case of our central bank, but purchasing debt from provinces and from the private sector as well. So I think this is one way to ease this financial market pressure. It is extraordinary, just how much debt is turning over in Canada. I think, again, a lot of the interesting stuff in the budget is in the annexes. It's a 700-page document, but there's probably 400 pages of annexes. And one of them is the debt management strategy. So there, Canadians can go look and say, well, how much money do we have to go to the markets for this year? It's probably in the neighborhood of $500 billion, which is extraordinary, much bigger than the $150 billion deficit. A lot of that debt is turning over. How much of that debt will be short-term or long-term? You could see the strategies. They're trying to purchase more long-term. But you could see already in the markets in Canada and around the world, the yields on these 10-year government bonds they're increasing. People think growth is coming back. People think inflation is coming back, and they don't want to purchase 10-year instruments unless there's some protection for what they think will be higher inflation, which will come to higher growth. So yeah, it's just like this experiment is continuing. People are wondering, will inflation make a comeback? And I think in some cases, this, again, the extraordinary monetary and fiscal stimulus, you assume there's going to be some inflationary pressure come the fall if we're successful in the pandemic. So yeah, we have to watch this. And, are we overstimulating these economies? But again, as Nick and Nancy said, the crisis we're still solving is really the first and foremost is the pandemic.
So one last question before we close this out for the day, and that is, was there anything that stood out in the budget for you as a surprise? Anything that you thought, wow, I didn't expect that to be in there, or as a surprise because it wasn't in there? And we've already talked about the 724 pages, but any surprises? And I'll let anybody who wants to go first.
I'll start because this was one of the things that I was really hoping to see. I know that across the country, mental health and addictions it's been an issue. It's just not been an issue that has been in the forefront. And I think with COVID and the pandemic and lockdowns and people out of work, those two things have been highlighted. I don't want to use the word crisis. That word gets thrown around, I think, far too much, but it is a huge issue in, I would say, every province across the country. And I guess it's tied a bit to the health transfers to the provinces, but I was really surprised that there wasn't a really big focus on mental health and addictions. There is some in there. It's tied specifically to COVID-related mental health issues. I don't know what that means because people had mental health issues before COVID hit. They were just highlighted during this pandemic, so I'm not exactly sure the details or the idea behind that sort of wording, but I would have expected more, if you've got 10 priorities, I was surprised that wasn't one of them, is really contributing and funding to, I would say funding to the provinces. It's up to the provinces to deliver on those issues when it comes to mental health and addictions. It's a provincial responsibility. And I know provinces have been stepping up in their own budgets to help cover that. And I know that there's been other federal funding in previous years that have come to the provinces, but I would have expected more on that front, considering what we're dealing with. It's one thing to talk about jobs, but if you're not mentally healthy enough to engage in the workplace, a job's irrelevant. If you aren't mentally healthy enough to engage in the workplace, childcare is irrelevant. If you have addictions issues, are you participating? So to me, it's kind of one of the first questions we should be asking, because the other things follow from that. You need healthy people to be engaged, and I was really surprised that wasn't part of it.
Nick and Kevin, any surprises?
I was surprised at how inoffensive this budget was. There was no, to Nancy's point, there was no orange poison pill, there was no blue poison pill, no green poison pill, no light blue poison pill. I think I've covered the whole gamut. But you know, the thing is that if we had listened to the couple weeks before then, especially the Liberal Policy Convention, where there was talk about a universal basic income, when there was talk about taxes on capital gains, all that kind of stuff, I saw that stuff as like, okay, we start doing some of this and it's going to rile some people up, right? And my big surprise is that you know, the government, and maybe this was part of their strategy, put out those trial balloons and then make the budget look reasonable and just focused on the pandemic. So that was my big surprise. Nothing inoffensive, at least really inoffensive to opposition parties.
Kevin.
Yeah, so thank you, Nancy. And actually for leading off with mental health, I think there's going to be, I think people are stressed and that's going to have an impact on our health and our labor force, our productivity. I'll just come back just to the numbers. Probably that's why I'm at the panel, even though Nick is the data scientist. But I will say that people would be surprised when you look at these fiscal numbers, if you kind of, like, where did the government find the resources for $140 billion worth of spending over 6 years, or $100 billion stimulus? And literally it comes from a forecast adjustment. So last fall, they had a forecast, which was kind of for growth pickup in 2021-22, but this got elevated, you know, with a sense that if we roll out the vaccine, the economy is going to be much stronger, that stimulus is going to have a big impact. So almost 75% of that $140 billion package was paid for by a stroke of the pen on the forecast. It's like the source of funds is really a projection by the Department of Finance, or an average private sector forecast that growth is going to be much stronger. I don't think people really know that, but it's been a habit that the Liberals have really taken on really since 2015. If they get a positive economic surprise, language of an economist, the growth turns out to be stronger, they will spend it. So again, they found an extra $115 billion because growth is projected to be much higher. They spent that plus an additional 30 or so. I don't know if that's a surprise, but again, that's the behind the scenes arithmetic of a budget.
Well, on that note, I just want to say thank you to each of our panelists for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. I've had a great time chatting with all of you. I also want to thank our Institute staff for all their behind the scenes work in pulling this together. And I'd like to thank those who have listened or who are going to listen to this webinar for joining us today. I wish that everybody will stay safe and stay healthy. And until the next time, thank you very much and have a great afternoon. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.